Sure.
There's a man with a fishing pole in the middle of the street.
And that implies that he works for the sewer department. He's testing equipment.
And that implies that he doesn't smell very good.
And that implies that he really doesn't have a lot of friends.
And that implies that he spends a lot of time in his basement.
And that implies that he works on home hobbies and crafts.
And that implies that he orders materials from the backs of comic books.
And that implies that he reads comic books, a lot of comic books.
And that implies that he had a troubled childhood.
And that implies that his old man was a real piece of work.
And that implies that his old man didn't think much of him.
And that implies that his old man didn't think much of himself to begin with.
And that implies that his old man was raised during the Depression.
And that implies a whole bunch of hard times for a lot of people.
And that implies that there wasn't a lot of money to spend.
And that implies that kids went hungry and people begged on the streets.
And that implies that there was a lot of resentment built up against those who had money.
And that implies that those who have money built stronger fences.
And that implies that there was work building strong fences for the rich people.
And that implies that a few poor people got a good day's work here and there.
And that implies that once they got their work, they'd go home and spend it on things like alcohol.
And that implies that they'd get drunk and start telling wild stories.
And that implies that the wilder the stories were, the more they'd think that they could get them published and read.
And that implies that some of these drunken people became comic book artists.
And that implies that these comic book artists were alcoholic, no-good doers.
And that implies that they came and went.
And that implies that no one remembers who they were.
And that implies that certain people would be compelled to collect these things and keep them alive.
And that implies that there is a secret society of people who understand this.
And that implies that these people are transcending their troubled childhoods.
And that implies that now that they've transcended their troubled childhoods, they are whole.
And that implies that they're really great philosophers, but unknown to most people.
And that implies that they frame their philosophies in comic book terms.
That implies that they walk down the street saying "pow, biff," and unhand that woman to themselves.
And that implies that most people think they're crazy.
And that implies that they, as a result, tend to keep to themselves.
And that implies that they need to find things to do while they're by themselves.
And that implies that they would, for example, take a job working for the sewer department.
And that implies that they might stand in the middle of the street with a fishing pole.
And that implies that they are, in their own way, happy.
Interesting turnaround.
Yeah. That just happened. It's like a boomerang.
In some ways, that's almost easier than yes and. Or it's just
Yeah.
because it's the inverse.
I
It's
like